Thank you, Charles. First of all, thank you for having me here, Charles. It's a great opportunity. Or spending here my sabbatical year 3 years ago was a great time, and coming back, it's really something that I need to thank you and your organization for organizing that. I think the subject matter, the U.S. foreign policy and the rise of Islamism, is a crucial subject matter which needed to be discussed in this prestigious institute, the Hoover Institute, and thank you for arranging all of that. I'm especially happy to be here, but I would say that I would be more happy to speak about more optimistic subject matters than the subject that you decided to have today. Coming from the place I'm coming from, Israel, we live under the constant Chinese curse. I mean, you live in interesting times. So these are really interesting times in the Middle East. I would say we are all facing now changes, maybe tectonic changes in the region. And about a year ago, when immediately after those changes started in the Middle East, the revolutions in different Arab countries, many people around the world, and especially in the United States, was arguing, well, we need to wait and see. We don't know what will be the outcome of that. Basically, there were two schools. There was the school who was saying this is a positive process, and it would lead at the end of the day. We don't know when will be the end of the day, but it will lead to something which will be much better than it is today. The traditional regimes in the Arab countries are changed, and democracy is replacing those regimes, and this definitely would lead to something which is better than what we see today. The other school, which was arguing that the process is a negative process, was saying that this so-called democratic process is leading to a situation in which fundamentalists and extremists are taking advantage of democratic apparatuses of elections, and they are taking over those countries, and the outcome would be problematic not only to the region, I would say to the whole world at the end of the day. So in the first part of my presentation today, I would like to describe the way I understand this process, and maybe to try to answer the question, is it a positive or a negative process? The second question that I would discuss in my presentation would be, in reference to the title that you have decided, what is the connection of that process to the American foreign policy? Is there any connection? As a counterterrorism expert, that's what I do, running the ICT, the Institute for Counter-Terrorism in Israel. What I would describe is the American counterterrorism policy and the connection with the American counterterrorism policy to the Arab Spring in the Middle East and in the Arab world altogether. As for the first question, is it a positive or a negative process? I think that we already can and have the right to feel uneasy and to be concerned with the process that is happening today. And what we already see after a little bit more than a year since the revolution started, first in Tunisia, moving on to Egypt and Libya, now in Syria, Yemen, and I don't think that this process is going to end soon. After Syria, we would have other countries that will fall into this chaotic situation which is called the Arab Spring. In Israel, we tend to refer to that as the Islamic winter more than the Arab Spring. But today, after a year and a half since the process started, what we can see and what we can analyze is the short-term implications of this process, and maybe to try to understand what would be the long-term implications of that process. As for the short term, what we see is that states that had these traditional regimes, traditional leaderships, becoming much less controllable. The territories becomes uncontrolled territories. the states become failed states and with no concrete statehood capability. And what I describe here, which is true to Libya, we see it in Egypt, definitely we see it in the northern part of Egypt, in the Sinai Peninsula. We are starting to see that happening in Syria. Yemen suffered from that for a long period of time. The common denominator of those processes is that those territories are becoming heaven for Islamic radical terrorists, extremists, global and local jihadists, which are being rooted and flourishing in those specific territories. So the first thing that we see is the strengthening of the local and global jihadi elements. By the way, the scholars which are analyzing that invented a new term for that, which is glocal. It's a combination of global and local jihadi terrorist activity. And we see this dangerous combination being rooted in different parts of the world, around Libya, around the Maghreb countries, in Africa, Central Africa, and also in the Middle East and other parts of the world. That's the first short-term trend. The second one, which is synergetic to the first one, is that those elements, the local jihadi terrorist organizations, are much more weaponized than it used to be prior to the Arab Spring. The first reason, or this was an immediate outcome of taking over the military warehouses and weapons of the Libyan army. The terrorists, especially the Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, took over this sophisticated weapon. And first time ever we see those terrorists being weaponized with sophisticated modern weapons that was never used before by terrorists. But it didn't stop there, because they immediately transferred this weapon to different parts of the world, especially to parts in which Islamists and jihadists are fighting other groups in those territories that I've described before. We see this weapon being smuggled to Sinai, today to Syria, to Gaza Strip, to Mali, Nigeria, and so on and so forth. So that's the short-term influence, which is giving much more strength to local and global jihadi terrorists. As for the long term, we already heard the spokesman of the Muslim Brotherhood, and I think it gives a quite clear understanding that this debate questioning the nature of the Muslim Brotherhood, are they really moderate or not, I think it's a clear answer to that question. But even if we take under consideration that the Muslim Brotherhoods are moderate, which I beg to differ, but never mind, even if they are, we know already that the Muslim Brotherhood concepts, the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood, the ideology that was set by Hassan al-Banna and other ideologists more than 100 years ago, gave birth to the most problematic elements, violent elements of the jihadist terrorists in the world. Take, for example, the leader of Al-Qaeda today. The leader of Al-Qaeda today is Zawahiri. He is a product of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. He's an Egyptian that was, his early education, he was getting in the Muslim Brotherhood madrasas, schools in Egypt. Yes, he differs from the Muslim Brotherhood today. They have a lot of ideological disputes, and he condemned and criticized the Muslim Brotherhood, but nevertheless, the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood have radicalized him, at least in the beginning of the process, and the outcome was that he was the main ideologist of Al-Qaeda. Another example is Hamas. Hamas, this terrorist organization, if you read the covenant of Hamas, one of the main articles of the covenant explains that Hamas, by definition, is the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood group in Palestine. So they refer to themselves, this terrorist organization referred to itself as a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. By the way, the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. Again, the founders of Hamas, Ahmad Yassin, was a Muslim Brotherhood, Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood student. So even for the long term, I would argue that if the Muslim Brotherhood would not support terrorism, would not conduct terrorist attacks, would not support terrorist organization, which still needed to be proven, but if it will be the case, they will invest a lot of resources in doing what? In buying more hearts and minds to their ideology that at the end of the day will give birth to these bad seeds that will create splinters from these groups and will intensify the number and the danger coming from those Islamic radical elements altogether. As for the midterm, and this is concerning Israel, we see that those changes of regimes is leading to a much more problematic relations between Israel and Egypt on one hand, and strengthening the Salafist element and the Palestinian terrorist organization, both in Gaza and in Sinai. I don't want to get too much into that subject matter because this is not what we discussed today. So, going back to the question, is it a positive or a negative process? No doubt in my mind that we are witnessing a very problematic and negative process that would change the face of even humanity, definitely the global arena, definitely the Muslim world and the Arab world. And as said before, we are in the beginning or the midst of the process, definitely not the end of that process. Now, the question is, okay, so what's the connection between this negative process and American foreign policy, or as I said before, the American counter-terrorism policy, at least in my view? Well, we should call a spade a spade. United States didn't create the Arab Spring, didn't even lead the Arab Spring. It's an authentic process that, came as a popular uprising, a kind of internal revolutions in those Arab countries altogether. But I would argue that without the American backwind, without the support that the current presidency in the United States gave to those revolutionaries, being influenced by those positive, naive euphoria that this process is going to lead to a much better and much more stable world, without this backwind, the Arab Spring would not sustain and definitely would not move from one country to another country altogether. And I'll explain that argument. You know, when I was here 3 years ago as a Koret Fellow, it was the time that President Obama won the elections. And the first, I believe it was the first step in foreign policy that the president took was what? Was flying to where? Egypt, and giving the very famous Cairo speech. By the way, he chose to fly to Cairo. It was not a coincidence because United States referred to Egypt and referred to the leader of Egypt, President Mubarak, as the main ally of United States in the Arab world, and it was just natural that the first speech that he will give and conveying his message to the Muslim world will be in Egypt when President Mubarak is beside him. And the message was quite clear. You know, Islam, we are not in any war with Islam, and this is, of course, true, and it was an important message. Immediately after the speech was taken, I was asked to be interviewed by a TV channel here in the region. And the first question that they posed to me is, what is the reaction in Israel, a few hours after the speech, to the speech in Cairo? So I said, look, you know, temporarily I live here in the Bay Area, not in Israel, so I don't know what is the reaction in Israel, but I'm an Israeli. So Israeli, if he doesn't have the answer, he give you an answer in any case. So I would say that in Israel we have right now mixed feelings towards the speech in Cairo. He said, can you elaborate on that? I said, of course, it's a combination of hope and concern. The concern is that it seems from analyzing the speech that using those buzzwords and so on and so forth, it seems that the president do not fully understand the complexity of the situation in the region, the problems that we are facing, and the hope is that maybe we are wrong and he's right, and the outcome would be a much better situation and condition, and then we will be one of the first benefactors of that. The second question that was posed to me by the TV channel is, what is the reaction of the Jewish community in the Bay Area? And I said, look, I definitely do not represent the Jewish community in the Bay Area. But since you've asked me, I think that the Jewish community in the Bay Area has mixed feelings towards the speech in Cairo, which is a combination of hope and concern. So I said, so what's the difference between the reaction in Israel and the reaction of the Jewish community in the Bay Area? I said, look, in Israel we have much more concern and very little hope. In the Bay Area there is a lot of hope and very little concern. In a retrospective point of view, I would argue that my concern only grew since then. And the first pillar of this concern came when I listened to the speech that was given by the advisor for counterterrorism to the president, John Brennan. In his speech, when he first introduced the new American counterterrorism policy, one of the first statements was something along the lines of terrorism is not the enemy of the United States. Now, excuse me, you are the counterterrorism advisor to the president. You are not the human rights advisor to the president. How can you say such a thing? Yes, I know you are playing good words. As a scholar, sometimes I do the same. Terrorism is a tactic cannot be an enemy. Therefore, terrorism is not the enemy of the United States. Fine. But the next statement was even more problematic, and it was saying something along the lines of Islamists and jihadists are not the enemy of the United States. As an outcome of that, I wrote an op-ed in the English Journal of Israel, and I said, if jihadists and the Islamists is not the enemies of the United States, then who is the enemy of the United States? I was arguing there, and this was way back before the Arab Spring started. What is the message that you are sending to your pragmatic allies in the Muslim countries? And I mentioned as an example President Mubarak, and I said, what is the message that you are sending to President Mubarak, which his life is on stake and being under the concrete risk of being assassinated every day by the jihadists and the Islamists? And by the way, why? Because it's being regarded as the most important American ally in the Arab and the Muslim world. So how can you say that jihadists and Islamists are not the enemy of United States? When I try to analyze what's the differences between the two administrations, the Bush administration and Obama administration in reference to counterterrorism, it's quite clear, and you can see immediately the main differences between the two policies. First of all, in defining the enemy. President Bush administration defined the enemy as global jihadi terrorism. And President Obama refers to the enemy as secluded extremists, Al-Qaeda, and the affiliates of Al-Qaeda. That's the first difference between understanding the scale of the threat that the United States and the international community are facing. The second difference between the two is defining the goal. President Bush was defining the goal, it might be too wide, but it was exterminating and dismantling terrorism wherever it is, which includes, of course, terrorist organizations, supporters of terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism, and so on and so forth, while President Obama refers to the goal of, or the counterterrorism goal of his policy, to exterminate or dismantle Al-Qaeda and affiliates of Al-Qaeda, which of course is leading to what? To the targeted killings type of activity, drone attacks, and so on and so forth. In order to understand the basic differences between the two, I need to refer to what I call the formula of terrorism. What is the formula of terrorism? If you ask me if I can conclude everything I learned about terrorism for the last more than 30 years into one sentence, and if this will be the only sentence that you will get from my lecture today, the answer would be positive. Yes, we can condense everything into one sentence. That's the formula of terrorism. The formula of terrorism is a very simple mathematical formula that has two factors: motivation and operational capability. It means when a certain group of people has both motivation to launch terrorism, and operational capability to materialize the motivation, then a terrorist attack or a terrorist campaign would occur. From the formula of terrorism, we can conclude, therefore, what is the formula of effective counterterrorism? The same formula. If you really want to be effective in counterterrorism, you need to counter the operational capability of the terrorists by fighting them, dismantling their capabilities. And you need to deal with the motivation that leads to terrorism. It's not enough to deal with one factor. You need to work in both tracks at the same time. Unfortunately, easier said than done, because there is a contradiction between the two. Once you are trying to limit the operational capability of the terrorists, fighting them, like it or not, you raise their motivation to retaliate. In the literature of counterterrorism, we call it the boomerang effect in counterterrorism. So why did I share this with you? Because I would argue that both presidents and their advisors fully understand the formula of terrorism. They don't need me to explain them the formula of terrorism. And both presidents really try to work or to deal with those two tracks at the same time, to counter the operational capability of the terrorist and the motivation. But the differences between the two was what was the emphasis of their policy. While President Bush was emphasizing the importance of dealing with the operational capability of the terrorists or dismantling their operational capability, and yes, then deal with motivation that leads to terrorism, President Obama changed the equation and put the most emphasis on countering the motivation. And yes, he also very active, as we know, in countering the operational capability, but this is a secondary goal. Now, when we are talking about zooming in on how do you counter motivation, what's the difference between the two policies in countering the motivation, there was a real difference between, and there is a real difference between the two administrations. And here I want to argue that we have to differ between two types of motivations. I call them root causes and instrumental causes. The root causes are really the main reasons and the main motivation that give birth to the terrorist activity. The instrumental causes are conditions that are being misused by the terrorists. Now, when we talk about the policy of President Bush, he identified the root causes as those Islamic fundamentalist ideologies that we just heard one of the examples of one of the spokesmen of those elements. And this is the root cause that give birth to terrorists and terrorist activity all over the world. And not only just against Israelis or against Americans or against the Western countries, but also against moderate Muslims altogether. While President Obama administration refers to regional conflict as the causes, but those are instrumental causes. Yes, if you simplistically are referring to what are the reasons that you see the rise of terrorism worldwide, if you take any person in a Muslim country and just question him, he will mention those regional conflict, he will mention poverty and so on and so forth. But those are excuses and those are instrumental causes which are being misused in order to camouflage the real root causes altogether. And one thing the United States need to remember all the time, United States was not attacked in 9/11 because of anything that United States did prior to 9/11. It's not because American so-called colonialism, American so-called exploitations of Muslim land and so on and so forth. United States was attacked in 9/11 and still being the main target of those terrorists worldwide because what United States is. And United States is being regarded as the spearhead of the Western society, of the Western culture, of human rights, of liberalism, of modernity. And this is the biggest threat to the global and the local jihadists. And this is why United States have been attacked, and this is why United States will be attacked in the future, unfortunately. Now, to sum this up, and we need to go back to the turmoil in the Arab Spring. I said that at the beginning in the United States, and it was a bipartisan reaction. It was Democrats and Republicans. The reaction was some kind of euphoria. Even the term Arab Spring actually is referring to a certain type of euphoria in reference to that specific process, but this was an outcome of two, I would argue, of two misunderstandings that both parties and many American citizens, regardless their involvement in this or the other party, was falling into. And those two misconceptions, A, was that democracy is a miracle solution to violence, political violence, extremism, radicalism, and terrorism. That's the first false belief. The second false belief or misconception was that election is democracy. What many Americans unfortunately forgot is that democracy is something which is much bigger than election. Election is a very important apparatus of democracy, but it's one apparatus. Democracy is first and foremost something much more substantial. It's a system of values. It's civil society. It's women's lib. It's human rights. It's liberalism. That's what democracy is all about. And if you forget about it and you just use elections and give the ability to fundamentalists to take advantage of this, by doing what? By changing hearts and minds of the people in an ongoing indoctrination, incitement, and education for many years. And one day you are giving the ability to those people to choose and to vote, then you get a situation in which fundamentalists are taking over those regimes and those countries, and the outcome is one man, one vote, one time. So what's the conclusion? I would argue, although my presentation was quite gloomy, as you can understand, but I'm coming from Israel, and you cannot be gloomy living in the bad neighborhood that we are living. You always have to cling to the hope. And I'm still clinging to this specific hope. And the hope is based on the fact that this is only the beginning of the process, negative process, but it's a beginning of the process, and still a lot can be done, and a lot of influence can be conducted in order to change the course of this process. Egypt, which is one of the most important pillars of the process of the Arab Spring, Egypt still relies a lot on American support, and they cannot sustain without this American support. This American support gives the American administration the leverage which is needed to influence. It would not make them, it would not make the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood pro-Americans, liberals, or Zionists for that matter, but it definitely can limit this kind of indoctrination. And if there is one recommendation that I can give to the American administration, whoever it will be after the election, is you should give those dollars that you are giving under the condition. And the condition is that those regimes that are now changing would give the right emphasis in introducing the right values to their own constituencies. And it can be measured. Are those processes becoming less dogmatic, less radical, and giving the ability, for example, for NGO, human rights activists, the ability to work, what the reaction towards the rights of women, the rights of minorities, and so on and so forth. Those should be the tests and the measurements in order to make the decision if they are getting the support of the United States or not. Thank you very much.